Chapter 5: Feminism, Feminist Critique of Development Models, Alternative Development Model for Third World Women. At the end of this chapter, you will be able to know the following: what is feminism, different dimensions of feminism, understand the concept of feminist epistemology, know the feminist criticism of traditional research process, know and apply feminist methodology in understanding gender, feminist critique of development models, and alternative development model for women in third world. What is feminism? Feminism is not only a social theory but also a political practice. Although the question of women's inequality is central to all ideas in feminism, the remedies and the resulting influence of society on women's emancipation are all open to dispute. Ramazanoglu, 1999. Feminism is a movement, a set of beliefs that problematize gender inequality. Feminists believe that women have been subordinated through men's greater power. Variously expressed in different arenas, they value women's lives and concerns and work to improve women's status. There are many feminisms with different emphasis and aims. Defining feminism. Defining feminism is a problematic and contentious affair. Many theorists have identified problems with understanding the meaning of the concept, which have made it difficult to arrive at a single definition. Further, there are different explanations of the relations between the sexes, male and female. In each case, women's inequality has been explained differently, and hence different solutions have been suggested. In addition, there are contradictions and differences in the nature of women's lives and experiences. For example, along the lines of race, class, and sexuality, it is therefore difficult to find a way of defining feminism which will be meaningful to all women. Ramazanoglu, 1989-1919. As producing an all-embracing definition was difficult, researchers have outlined the main components of feminism as follows. I believe that relations between men and women are unequal and should be changed. And understanding the changes to existing relations between men and women would have fundamental consequences for a wider range of social relationships. And understanding the relations between the sexes are politicized, analysis resting on a particular conception of politics that does not distinguish between the political and private spheres, and therefore acknowledges that political power operates at the personal level as well as at a social level. Thus, most definitions of feminism, for instance, begin with an acknowledgement of women's inequality, oppression, subordination, and the need to change the situation and improve the quality of women's lives. For example, as some scholars have stated that there are excellent reasons for thinking that women suffer from systematic social injustice because of their sex. Radcliffe Richards, 1980, 13-14. Jagger defines feminists broadly as all those who seek, no matter on what grounds, to end women's subordination. Jagger, 1853-5. However, the underlying meaning of the term inequality implies difference and disadvantage, rather than of subordination, as the definitions emphasize in feminism. There is the realization and recognition that any changes in existing relations between men and women would bring about fundamental consequences for a wider range of social relationships. For instance, Botham suggests a wider implication. According to her, feminism is a movement against hierarchy which goes beyond the liberation of a sex. It contains the possibility of equal relations not only between women and men, but between men and men, women and women, and even between adults and children. Botham, 1985-14. Again, Bell Hooks emphasizes the wider implications of feminism as a radical movement that would eradicate domination and transform society. Feminism therefore marks a commitment of recognizing society so that self-development of people can take place. Hooks, 1987. An integral part of understanding the concept of feminism is that it extends to the arena of the nature of power to cover both the public and private sphere. As Robotham argued that a feminist theory would develop existing definitions to include domestic inequality, identity control over sexuality, Robotham, 1985. Finally, feminism entails an ethical and political commitment, provides a social theory through which to understand and explain women's lives and experiences. Feminism, however, cannot be understood by a single theory, because not only are there different explanations of relations between the sexes, but women have different experiences of inequality based on race, class, and sexuality. Lastly, different approaches to feminism provide different causes of women's oppression and subordination. In developing frameworks, theory for understanding and explanations of women's inequality, therefore, it is important to understand the different perspectives of feminism based on the approaches, dimensions of feminism, feminist perspectives and their support subtypes. Dimensions of feminism: liberal feminism, Marxist feminism, radical feminism, social feminism, ecofeminism. Different currents in feminism. Liberal feminism. Liberal feminism was the earliest view that attracted women who were seeking ways to change a male-dominated, unjust society. Liberal feminism is rooted in the tradition of 16th and 17th century liberal philosophy, which focused on the ideals of equality and liberty. The first Western feminist theory, Mary Wollstonecraft, in a vindication of the rights of women with structures on political and moral subjects, argued that women's capacity to reason was equal to that of men and that the biological sex differences were irrelevant to the granting of political rights. Wollstonecraft, 1792. He argued that the reason women appeared to be intellectually inferior was due to their inferior education and therefore was the result of inequality. Liberal feminists see women's subordination as resulting from gendered norms rather than from biological sex and aim to change these norms. They focus on equal opportunities for women and men. According to this group, liberation for women is possible through legal reform. Existing sexual inequalities can largely be corrected through legislative reforms. It is the law, not structures or ideas, that need to be changed. Jagger, 1983. Marxist feminism. The Marxist feminists strongly criticized the liberal feminists on the ground that their ideologies and strategies were grossly inadequate and safely apolitical and ahistorical. Following Eagle's Marxist feminists claim that the exploitation and oppression of women is historically rooted in the institution of private property, which is the cornerstone of capitalism. In Engel's 1884 classic, The Origins of the Family, Private Property and the State, he argued that when hunting-gathering was replaced by agriculture, a more efficient and productive mode of production, a few men got control of the productive resources and transformed them into private property. Women have been systematically deprived of ownership of property, have been relegated to the domestic sphere, and so are treated by men as only the reproductive agents of society. Contemporary Marxist feminists continue this line of argument by asserting that capitalism, the current form of class society, perpetuates the subordination of women by enforcing their economic dependence on men. Therefore, the main tool of Marxist feminists is class struggles and revolution, which will bring about new production relations and emancipation of women. Radical feminism. Radical feminists insist that women's subordination does not depend on other forms of domination, such as class. They argue that patriarchy or the domination of women by men is primary. Although radical feminists argue on the primary of women's subordination, they have a variety of views on the origins and nature of this subordination. Taking somewhat a separatist stand, they claim that the root cause of women's exploitation is biological. It is the reproductive role of women that makes them weak and dependent. Shulamit Firestone, 1970. In The Dialectic of Sex, the case for feminist revolution argued that women's subordination is rooted in their biology, that is, their reproductive psychology. Without changing basic biological features, emancipation was not possible. This implied that only a revolution in biotechnology would change women's condition. She argued that only with advanced technology such as test tube babies would women achieve equality and no longer be dependent on men. Many radical feminists argue that women's subordination is rooted in male control over women's fertility and sexuality, that is, over women's bodies. Socialist feminism. Socialist feminists emerged in the second half of the 1970s. They were dissatisfied with Marxists, which saw women's subordination as secondary to class subordination. They also felt discomfort with radical feminists, which ignored class and saw patriarchy or women's subordination as the primary form of subordination. Socialist feminists redefined the radical feminist conception of patriarchy, added an historical dimension to the concept of patriarchy, arguing that it takes different forms in different historical periods and in different radical racial, cultural, political, economic, and religious contexts. They also argued that Marxist definition of economic activity had to be expanded to include both productive and reproductive work. Taking a less radical stand, elaborating on the Marxist theorists, socialist feminists further argued that women could not be emancipated from the clutches of male oppression unless capitalistic socioeconomic structures are destroyed, and at the same time, one makes sure that women's issues are not subsumed in the class struggle. Socialist feminists see oppression by class, gender, and race, three strong vines which have become so intertwined that they can no longer be separated. These vines have grown into an enormous branch which holds women up down. All the vines must be cut to free women. Juliet Mitchell, in her early classic collection of essays, Women, the Longest Revolution, argued that there were four interlocking structures to be considered in women's subordination. Mitchell, 1994, there were production, reproduction, sexuality, and childbearing. To understand women's subordination, she said it was necessary to understand not only how the needs for food, clothing, and shelter are met, but also how the need for sexuality and emotional nurturance are met. Ecofeminism. Within the women's movement, there is a range of different groups and ideologies. The Third World Group, Developing Alternative with Women for a New Era Dawn, sees feminism as an essential political movement with, at its core, a commitment to breaking down the structures of gender subordination and a vision of women as a full and equal partners with men at all levels of societal life. Ecofeminism has been described as a philosophy made flesh by our passion to create ourselves in deep communion with our planet. Dawn. Many women perceive ecofeminism as expressing how, in some sense, they are intimately connected to and part of the earth. Ecofeminism is a social movement that regards the oppression of women and nature as interconnected. Most work on women and the environment in the third world has focused on women as special victims of environmental degradation. Ecofeminists agree that the domination of women and the domination of nature are fundamentally connected and that environmental efforts are therefore integral with work to overcome the oppression of women. Ecofeminists do not seek equality with men as such, but aim for a liberation of women as women. Ecofeminists believe that patriarchal society is built on four interlocking pillars: sexism, racism, class exploitation, and environmental destruction. More recently, ecofeminist theorists have extended their analysis to consider the interconnections between sexism, the domination of nature, and also racism, and also inequalities. Consequently, it is now better understood as a movement working against the interconnected oppression of gender, race, class, and nature. The ecofeminism owes its origins to the relationship between women and nature, and perhaps also that to the fact that environmental and women's movements both become prominent about the same time. To say that women and nature are intimately associated is not to say anything revolutionary. The new insight provided by rural women in the third world is that women and nature are also not associated not in passivity but in creativity and in the maintenance of life. The women and environment issue can be approached either from the categories of challenge that have been thrown up by modern in the social struggle for life, or it can be approached through an extension of conventional categories of patriarchy and reductionism. In the perspective of women engaged in survival struggles, which are simultaneously struggles for the protection of nature, women and nature are intimately related and their domination and liberation similarly linked. The women and ecology movements are therefore one and are primarily counter trends to a patriarchal maldevelopment. Shiva, 1989. Feminist epistemology. An epistemology is a theory of knowledge, a philosophical position on the nature of what we know and now we know. Crawford and Marek, 1989, 479. Epistemology is interested in what counts as knowledge and who can be a better knower. Epistemologies work as justificatory strategies based on observation, reason, and authority. There is no one feminist epistemology. In discussing epistemology, feminists tackle with three concepts such as truth, reality, and objectivity. Constructing a feminist to knowledge which is objective and true has been a major concern of feminists in the last 30 years. Objectivity and truth, however, continue to be the hallmarks that guaranteed and legitimized the production of knowledge. Feminists in every epistemological stance believe that science is a social activity embedded in socio-historical context and shaped by personal concerns and commitments. Since the beginnings of feminist social science in the late 1960s and early 70s, the need for alternative feminist methods has been discussed. Millman and Cantor, 1975, Smith, 1979, and when in the 1980s, epistemology and methodologies became hot topics, many feminists proposed alternative methodologies. Other scholars, like critical theorists, participatory researchers, also debated the usefulness of mainstream social science research and developed alternative paradigms of methodologies. Feminists grapple with the epistemological concerns of value-sustaining and politicized inquiry, the connection between researcher and research, women's experience as source and justification of knowledge, and the nature of truth. Thompson, 1992, 3. It is important to distinguish between methodology and methods. For example, methodology concerns itself with how theories are applied to particular research. Marxist political economy is a methodology since it tells you that what things you need to know about in order to apply that theory: ownership of means of production, social relations, class differentiation, etc. Methods, on the other hand, are techniques for gathering evidence. Methodologies are theories and analysis of how research should proceed, and epistemologies are theories of knowledge or what could be thought of as justificatory strategies. There are no feminist methods of research, but there are feminist epistemologies and methodologies. The starting point of feminist research is the case for the multiple exclusions of women from science as respondents and researchers. Alright, and the male biases of research in which men have been the unmarked representation of humanity have commanded discourses of power, dominating the practice of science and produced knowledge bearing the particular stamp of male identities and interests. Jackson, 2006, Harding tried to show that science is an irretrievably male-biased tool of a socio-political power elite. Men represent the ruling part of society, obscuring the injustices of their unearned privileges and authority. Harding, 1989b, 274. Feminists have criticized traditional scientific approaches for treating the researched in unjust and oppressive ways. The objects of research are mastered, manipulated, controlled, scrutinized, silenced, deceived, exploited, and excluded. Feminists struggle with issues of exploitation and empowerment. Authorship: how participants are treated, respect for difference and diversity, responsibility and participants. Welfare: how colleagues treat one another, and use of findings. Thompson, 1992, 14. Feminist challenge to mainstream social science have invoked a variety of approaches of knowledge. Some have argued that orthodox accounts are empirically incorrect on their own terms, while others have claimed that the very way that men have constructed what counts as authoritative knowledge is itself patriarchally constructed. Oakley, 1974, Smith, 1988, Stanley and Wise, 1983. The more basic critique is that mainstream social science is simply empirically incorrect in relation to gender and those aspects of society that gender affects. For example, wage discrimination between men and women and violence against women can be shown to be empirically untrue by new methods of collecting information on these. The very way that mainstream science and social science construct knowledge is biased against women. Walby, 1990. Feminists use established methods of research to argue that conventional assumptions about women are unfounded. The feminist critique of the historical male-centered approach to research can be summarized as follows. The selection of sexist and elitist research topics, biased research including the use of male-only respondents, exploitative relationships between researcher and researched and within research teams, claims to false objectivity by those who seek the scientific and accurate interpretation, and over generalization of findings, including the application of theory to women from research on men. Feminist epistemologies are marked by the pro-women stance of feminism, a position of doing research for women. Given the pro-women stance of feminist research and the weight given to women's voices, feminists argue that it is precisely the subject position of women with particular kinds of social experiences that makes feminist knowledge less distorted or truer. The reason why feminist knowledge is stronger is not because it includes women, but also because women have superior access to experience, which includes that of being subordinated. To have a feminist standpoint is to have that understanding of life which comes through the struggles of being disdained and disadvantaged. Feminist epistemologies lay great emphasis on women's experiences, unlike traditional social science research. Jackson, 2006, 3537. Women's oppression is a complex of many contradictions and necessitates a new standpoint-based methodology created by researchers and participants of diverse race, class, and other oppressed groups, refocusing and revisioning knowledge based on theory, action, and experience. Gorelick, 1991, 495. Thus, we find that feminist epistemologies emphasize the validity of knowledge based on lived experiences and on gender identity. Following the conventional distinctions made by Harding, 1987, there are a number of feminist epistemologies. These include feminist empiricism, feminist objectivity, feminist reflexibility, feminist standpoint theory. What is feminist methodology? Feminist methodology have three distinctive goals. 1. Feminists seek a methodology that will do the work of excavation, that is, shifting the focus of standard practice for men's concerns in order to reveal the locations and perspectives of our women. The aim of much feminist research has been to bring women in, that is, to find what has been ignored, censored, and suppressed, and to reveal both the diversity of actual women's lives. A key method for doing this is to collect the personal testimony of individual women. Feminist researchers use another strategy to find voices for themselves or for women who share experiences that have been meaningful for them. Feminist methodologies have researched for practices that will minimize harm to women and limit negative consequences. Thus focuses not only on women's welfare but also particular research strategies drawing on the work of grassroots and professional women's organizations. 3. Feminists seek a methodology that will support research of value to women, leading to social change or action beneficial to women. In the 1990s, there have been a period of growth and development in feminist methodology. These included the adaptations of survey and experimental methods, interview research, inductive fieldwork, Marxist and ethno-methodological approaches, phenomenology, action participatory research, oral history, experimental ethnography, and methods based on post-structuralist insights. Default, 1996. One of the most useful statements of feminist methodology, published in 1986 by Judith Cook and Mary Fornow, identified 5 elements of feminist methodology based on a survey conducted earlier. Each of these challenges inequality in one way or the other. 1. Gender and inequality. The most obvious distinctive feature of feminist social research is that it focuses on gender and inequality. Feminists assume that there is widespread oppression of women by men and by patriarchal social patterns, and that this oppression is not natural or inevitable but can be changed. Recent research also considers multiple inequalities based on race, class, and other factors. These theoretical assumptions imply a strong political and moral commitment to reduce inequality, and feminists' methodology is focused on this aspect. Experience number two. Many feminist research describe the personal everyday experiences of women and men, especially women on the margin. They use qualitative methods such as interviews and ethnographies to validate feelings and activities that have been ignored or devalued in traditional research. The emphasis is on accurately portraying or giving voice onto women's experience. Action. Feminist research included an action or policy component aimed at social transformation or simply improving the conditions of particular women. This goal is often termed as doing research for women. The research may attempt to carry out some social change, such as establishing a shelter home or those women affected by rape or acid throwing. Number 4. Critique of research. Feminist research, which originated in opposition to traditional social science, continues to take a reflexive critical stance, questioning the conventional assumptions of feminists and analyzing how the research process is shared by gender, race, class, and sexual orientation of the researcher and by their broader social and cultural context. Recent work has focused especially on critiquing conventional categories that legitimize relations of domination. Participatory methods. Feminists tend to reject a rigid separation between researchers and researched and favor research that give research subjects more scope and power. For example, two-way interview process may be used instead of the traditional method in which the interviewer asks all the questions and behaves like a master. Oakley, 1981. To conclude, we might say that feminist methodology outlines an approach to research and that fits feminist values of challenging inequality and empowering women much better than conventional scientific research. Judith Cook and Mary Fornow, 1990, focused on the need for research to mean something to lead to change in women's lives, and that insisted on the search for techniques which analyze and record the historical process of change and ultimately the transfer of such methodological tools to the subjects of research so that they might confront their oppression and formulate their own plan of action. Feminist research is thus not research about women, but research for women to be used in transforming their sexist society. Cook and Fornow, 1990. Feminist critique of development models. Feminist critiques of development range from putting forward the following questions. The idea of integrating women in development, advocating a new ethical framework in which development process should be placed, challenging and concepts advanced by development researchers and agencies, the methods used by social scientists in gathering data from which development programs are designed. The first approach of the feminists is that they questioned the concept of development itself. The term development is usually used to be an exclusively economic sense by governments and international agencies. They assume that the state of a country's economy is itself an indicator of other social features. However, development in human society is not so simple and impersonal. Feminists define development in terms of improved human well-being rather than in terms of economic growth changes. They see development as a multifaceted process and tend to agree with the following definition given by Walter Rodney in his book entitled How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. He states that development at the level of the individual implies increased skill and capacity, greater freedom, creativity, self-discipline, responsibility, and material well-being. Ramji, 1997. Some of these categories are obviously moral ones and mean different things to different people depending on things like social class, ethnicity, and personal codes of ethics. In this aspect, two major groups of women, such as women in development and feminism, shaped and redefined women issues. The interaction between the two forces took place within the context of the UN Decade for Women, 1976 to 85. There was debates and struggles between women in the North and South as to determine what constituted women's issues. For example, women in development groups in Denmark held constructive dialogues about development for women, which participants from both industrialized and third world countries, particularly those in Asia and Africa. In another dialogue between feminists engaged in international networking and primarily a group representing North and South Americans held a forum to explain what they meant by feminism. They came to a common understanding by viewing that feminism as a political perspective on women's lives and the problems of domination. ISIS, 1983. Next, they argued that since early development models failed in many areas of the world because they ignored women, women had also learned that there can be no development without equality. For example, the recognition that acute food shortage in Africa, while caused by drought and war, may be due in large areas to the way women have been systematically excluded from access to land and from control of agriculture in that region. Taylor, 1985. Women in the West clearly understood that there can be no equality between men and women when economic development is lopsided. The impetus to redefine development came from several directions. Feminists saw the necessity of addressing issues of equality, violence against women, and reproductive rights of women in relation to economics and development. Women in development groups turned to agree with the feminist groups and expanded the definition of global feminism. In debating the idea of integrating women into development, the question of whether it can lead to an overall reprisal of the development concept remained open. Some saw the integration of women as inherently challenging to social and political structures, the distribution of wealth, cultural mores. It was not the model of development of the integration of women into development that one should care to recommend to other countries. What was necessary was that women should cooperate to integrate them into the international order. However, it was revealed that the new economic order was not different from the old one, not for the poor, least of all for women. Feminist criticism and the overemphasis on economic growth in most development plans coincided with other progressive critics. The predominant view during the first development decade was that economic growth would improve the overall situation of third world countries through the so-called trickle-down strategy. The recognition of the growing gap between survival needs and their fulfillment and the failure of growth to trickle down to the poor led to the mid-1970s to a significant shift in the stated orientation of multilateral development strategies in favor of basic human needs that emphasized the importance of project lending and grant targeted towards improvement in nutrition, health, water, sanitation, housing, and education. In later years, the global economic and debt crisis have led to a shift towards emphasizing basic needs in favor of structural adjustments programs designed by World Bank and IMF, which have had a devastating effect on the world's poorest, especially women. There are feminist critiques of the various stages of development planning, from the production orientation to the basic needs and project-oriented development approaches to the advocacy of structural adjustment. As Peggy Atrobus summed up, the upshot of these critiques is that development planning could be enormously enhanced if gender differences could be taken into account and recognition given to the fact that people, especially poor women, are capable of if their own efforts and initiatives are recognized and supported. Finally, step must be taken to build the infrastructures, the context in which women can feel some sense of control over their lives. Atrobus, 1987. During late 1970s and 80s, several international meetings made public declarations about feminist visions of development from a global perspective. The feminist critique of development models took place in three stages. One of the first international efforts produced a manifesto, often called the Bangkok Paper, APCWD 1979, sponsored by the UN Asian and Pacific Center for Women and Development. 15 women from the industrialized and developing countries gathered in Bangkok in 1979 to consider feminist ideology and structures in the first half of the decade for women. The group asserted that the oppression of women is rooted in both inequalities and discrimination based on sex and in poverty, and the injustices of the political and economic systems based on the race and class. It proposed one of the first global definitions of feminism with two long-term goals. 1. The achievement of women's equality, dignity, and freedom of choice through women's power to control their lives within and outside the home, and the removal of all forms of inequality and oppression through the creation of a more just social and economic order nationally and internationally. To achieve these goals, power for women was seen as essential. However, power was not to be considered in its traditional patriarchal definition as domination over others, but as a sense of international strength, a right to determine one's choices of life, and the right to influence the direction of social change. Power is critical for women, and one of the paramount goals of a feminist vision of development is the empowerment of women. The second attempt was a follow-up of the Bangkok meeting, which included an international workshop on developing strategies for the future. Feminist perspectives held in Stony Point, New York in 1980. This meeting approached development as a political process and stated the participants' dissatisfaction with the limited definitions of development as being traditionally confined to economic development measured by precise economic indices such as growth in the national product. The development process has not been neutral in how it affects the sexes and different classes, and the integrationist approach to development was unlikely to bring justice for women. The workshop concluded with a call for the empowerment of women, stating that unless women define their own needs, goals, and strategies, even benign governments would not change the basic structures which keep women in a subordinated position, as quoted in IWTC 1980. The last international workshop, held in Dakar, Senegal in 1982, aimed more specifically at the feminist question of development under the sponsorship of the African Women for Research and Development, AAWRD, and the Dag cajoled foundation, some 40 women and a few men from the south and north elaborated their vision and drew up the Dhaka Declaration on another development within women. The declaration began by analyzing the present crisis of the world system, which has increased inequalities between nations and within nations, as well as between women and men at the local level. It outlined how the crisis of capitalism as well as of existing socialist models of social progress have increased poverty, nationalization, militarism, and religious fundamentalism, all of which have worked against the interests of Women Development Dialogue 1982. Their vision was also structured and so suggested an alternative development paradigm of women in the third world. Alternative development model for women in third world. The most fundamental and underlying principle of another development should be structural transformation, a notion which challenges the economic, political, and cultural forms of domination which are found at the international and national and household levels. Accordingly, at the international level, another development should replace the norms of development dependent and unequal terms of exchange with that of independent development and mutually beneficial and negotiated terms of exchange and interdependence. For example, we may say that Bangladesh is a donor-driven country extremely dependent on donor aid. As a result, instead of becoming independent, Bangladesh is seen to be moving towards more dependent development. Again, when there is a change in the rate of currency, Bangladesh is hard hit by the exchange regulations made at the time of provision of aid, and the currency rate becomes higher due to the change in the exchange rate. This can be met by mutual negotiations between the concerned donor agencies and governments in Bangladesh. Nationally, models of development have to be based on the principles of self-reliance and the building of genuinely democratic institutions. Such a model would ensure wide general participation, including that of women, in the definition and actual provision of the basic needs of all citizens, regardless of their race, class, gender, or age. In Bangladesh, however, we find that instead of self-reliance, the development programs are making people more dependent, such as the work of NGOs, although working for women's development, are making them more dependent rather than making them self-reliant. On the other hand, the NGOs have become more dependent on the donor agencies, providing them with aid to carry out their activities. And for the democratic institutions, it is a pity to mention that the criteria of adult franchise is used as one of the basic characteristics of indicating democracy being prevailing in the country, whereas the other ideals of democracy, such as freedom of expression, movement, individual security, or recognition, are hardly practiced. At the household or local level, the vision of another development ought to reject existing structures that create or reinforce a sexual division of labor. Development Dialogue 1982. Here also we experience a sexual division of labor is still existing in the context of Bangladesh culture. Home is the place designated for women. Even if women work outside their family responsibilities, have to be given priority. In addressing the changes needed to achieve another development, the proponents stated that it will only be possible if patriarchal relations or practices are eliminated, which requires not only improving the situation of women but also changing it by opposing all ideologies that define women's role as subordinate, dependent, or passive. Feminism provides the basic for this new consciousness and for the cultural resistance to all forms of domination. Thus, the Dhaka statement articulates the feminist vision that opposition to gender subordination is both linked to and key ending other forms of domination. At this point, it is important to mention about another very noted third world feminist group, Dawn Development Alternatives with Women for a New Era, formed to define the issues of development from the vantage point of women. The 22 founding members of Dawn were activists, researchers, and policymakers from all regions of the third world, but with more emphasis on South Asia. Unlike previous manifestos, Dawn prepared a book that addresses specific issues in economic development as well as presenting overall feminist vision. Voices was considered a sense of urgency regarding the need to advocate alternative development processes. In outlining their vision and of development, members of Dawn stressed the belief that 1. In a movement for change that draws its ethical basis from women's daily lives, rights, rejects the effort to catch up with the competitive, aggressive spirit of the dominant system, seeks to convert men and the system to the sense of responsibility, nurturance, openness, and rejection of hierarchy essential to the feminist vision. Part of that vision is the acknowledgement of diversity and difference. Beneath this diversity and difference lies a commitment to breaking down the structures of gender subordination and a vision of women as full and equal participants with men at all levels of societal life. Sand and Grown, 1987. Done.